Hello, everyone. My name is Caroline Sawamoto, and I am co-founder and principal of IR Labs, an investor relations advisory firm based in Vancouver, BC. We are pleased to welcome you to 3H Properties' second live fireside chat and Q&A. Please note that this session is being recorded. 3H Properties Group is a Canadian developer changing the affordable housing industry for the better. 3H Properties' goal is to develop 100% affordable housing while creating long-term investment opportunities through partnerships with nonprofits and institutions to secure and develop land in secondary markets across Canada. 3H Properties has come to recognize the importance that preservation of existing affordable housing stock holds to achieving this goal. This recognition has inspired today's conversation with industry leaders Iman Novin and Patricia Roset-Zuppa. Today, we hope to glean knowledge and best practices from their unique perspectives to help tackle the current housing crisis. Before we begin, it's my pleasure to introduce our guests. First, the CEO and founding partner of 3H Properties, Alfredo Hermano. Because of Alfredo's own experience as an immigrant child within a family who relied on community and affordable housing to thrive and succeed in life, his substantive time in the construction industry, and his unique abilities to build teams and in a collaborative way, Alfredo not only started 3H Properties Group that is focused on 100% affordable housing, but is growing what he hopes will be a movement to change rental housing for the better. We also have with us Iman Novin. Iman has over 16 years of experience in the multifamily development sector and has involved with the development of over 9,000 multifamily units valued over $3.5 billion throughout California. Iman founded Novin Development to focus on urban infill, mixed income, and transit-oriented development projects with a double bottom line commitment to risk-adjusted returns and social and environmental sustainability. Iman has served as vice chair of the Walnut Creek Planning Commission and is currently serving on the Contra Costa County Council on Homelessness, board of directors of the Trinity Center, a nonprofit homeless service provider, and board of director of the Walnut Creek Chamber of Commerce. Iman also enjoys helping shape housing policy at the state level as an elected delegate in CA Assembly District 16 and member of the CADEM Legislation Committee. And finally, it's our pleasure to have Patricia Roset-Zuppa here with us today. Patricia is Vice President Policy at the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. She joined CMHC in 2009 and has held positions in strategic policy coordination, housing finance policy, and federal provincial territorial relations. Patricia played a lead role in the development of Canada's first ever national housing strategy. Prior to CMHC, Patricia worked in residential real estate, housing policy, and urban research in Canada and the United States. She holds a PhD in urban and regional planning from the University of Florida, an MBA from the Schulich School of Business, and master's in geography from Utrecht University in the Netherlands, where she was born and raised. She is an immigrant to Canada and proud Canadian and Dutch dual citizen. Following today's presentation, a recording will be made available and we'll be pleased to answer any additional questions you may have. As a matter of housekeeping for today's webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box on your screen. With that, I will now turn it over to Alfredo.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be here today with our guests. Thank you for being here. There are a number of factors that are making housing more expensive, but we know that the biggest issue is supply. Put simply, Canada is facing a housing shortage. We have a lower number of homes per person, than many OECD countries. That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, with 38 member countries. While we see strong investments in building of new homes, we cannot build at the same rate to replace existing affordable housing as it disappears. I want to start this discussion off with a case study. For those of you who attended our last webinar, we hosted with Jonathan Rose, you may recognize this. This is related to the Waterloo region of Ontario. So the Waterloo region has an approximate population of 500,000 residents. This is per StatsCan of 2016, 200,000 households. The region of Waterloo also contains the cities of Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge, sometimes also referred to as KWC. The region of Waterloo is at risk of losing hundreds of community housing units, roughly 2% of the population, which is run by local cooperatives and nonprofits that will have their mortgages paid within the next decade. This region is at risk of losing hundreds of community housing units over the next 10 years. And once these mortgages are paid, there's no legal obligation to keep those units affordable. Many of these are sold and intensified and made into condos or rental market product, and those affordable units are lost. So we know that affordable housing in Canada, and in some cases, really is not livable or affordable. Renting is proving to be increasingly difficult, and Canada is low on supply of affordable rentals. Clearly, we need a solution, and we believe preservation needs to be a significant part of that, alongside new builds. The recent recommendations from the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report primarily focuses on new supply, but I strongly believe that in order to truly tackle the housing crisis, we need to build both new builds and preservation of existing affordable housing. It is our pleasure to have Iman and Patricia here with us today and to hear their insights on this critical topic. Next slide, please. So at this point, we want to hear the perspectives on the housing challenge, and this is with Iman and Patricia. So to start off with our chat, we want to start with Iman, and afterwards, Patricia will offer the Canadian perspective. So Iman, the US builds approximately 100,000 affordable apartments each year. But for every new affordable apartment created, 2 are lost due to deterioration, abandonment, conversion to more expensive housing. Each year in Canada, 64,000 existing units are lost. That's 64,000 existing units are lost, 20,000 in Ontario alone. The Canadian National Housing Strategy is planning to build 16,000 new affordable units per year. And if 16,000 are built with 64,000 are lost, that means for each one built, 4 are lost. That's for each one built, 4 are lost. So starting with Iman, it is obvious for both countries that we can't keep up with the affordable rental housing demand solely through new construction. What role do you see preservation playing in solving the housing crisis?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Alfredo. This was a great question leading into this discussion about preservation. You know, preservation plays a immensely important role in the U.S. and California, where I'm focused. And you know, historically in the '60s, it was a very popular program through CDBG and other direct subsidies. And you know, it shifted sort of more recently to preserving or extending the life of existing deed-restricted affordable housing. But in just the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years, there's sort of been a renaissance in among both developers and policymakers in acquiring and preserving unsubsidized housing. So existing housing that may be market rent, but just given its age and location and population that it serves, is sometimes called naturally occurring affordable housing, or as I prefer to call it, unsubsidized housing. And There's a variety of benefits to preservation compared to new construction. One is the timelines that are much faster. It is also really important to recognize that when these types of properties are purchased by value add investors, and it often leads to displacement, and communities of color are more impacted by the loss of existing housing stock that is naturally affordable. And so to meet the demand, we sort of have to stop the loss on one side while we're continuing to build new housing on the other side. So it's not an either or strategy. I think it's a and it's great to see more developers focused on preservation of unsubsidized housing.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Iman. Patricia, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. Really happy to be part of this conversation. Since I've been part of this conversation for quite some time, before I came to CMHC, when I was in the States for about 4 years or so, this was really a hot topic as well. And that's going back to almost 20 years ago now. And where there was a lot of activity to ensure that we maintain that preservation. So in the Canadian context, it's, I mean, similarly, we're having enormous challenges, of course, with housing affordability, generally in the market, specifically with affordable housing, where there's really a lack of affordable housing, and impacting quite a few Canadians in that way. That was no difference before COVID, of course, but I think it's brought even more light to it through COVID. It's brought even more attention to it. The intensity has increased in terms of those households that are really in lowest income brackets and that are most vulnerable are really getting impacted by this lack of affordability and the lack of affordable housing. So something that we are very acutely aware of and work in this space on a daily basis to ensure that we understand the issues, that we have the data and the evidence that we can use to build the best policy advice that we can. I would say it's really, we need very much a wholesome approach when it comes to housing, and preservation has to be part of that. There is huge issues that we're dealing with in housing. There is not a quick fix. There's not one solution. There's also not one level of government or one sector that has all of the answers or the tools. So it has to be very much a toolkit kind of approach where we're looking at everything that we need to do to ensure that the supply is available and the affordability is there. And so on CMHC side, in terms of the approach that we're taking, we absolutely have a strong focus on new construction through the National Housing Strategy to ensure that we continue to build the supply. But there is also a focus on renovation and retrofit to make sure that the existing supply is in good condition for everyone to live in. And there is also a focus on the existing, sort of the old social and public housing stock to, at least for the time being, ensure that additional funding keeps going to that housing stock. Some of that is, they have agreements in place with the federal governments or provincial territorial governments. And we've been able to continue, at least for the time being, to provide funding to those projects once those mortgages come to an end, so that at least they can continue to support the households that live there. But preservation absolutely must be part of the solution. As you mentioned, if we keep building new homes, but we're losing on the other hand, we're really no farther ahead. And so I would say as a country, it has to be part of our solution when we look for it.
Thank you, Patricia, and an excellent perspective with having lived in the US and studied this specific subject. So thank you for your perspective there. Next question. Approximately 30% of Canadians rely on rental housing to meet their housing needs. CMHC offers both funding opportunities and mortgage loan insurance products to support construction, purchase, and refinancing of rental properties. Also, the Rental Construction Financing Initiative provides low-cost loans that will encourage the construction of sustainable rental apartment projects across Canada. Patricia, can you provide examples where CMHC programs have helped address the gap in affordable rental housing?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about it at a bit of a higher level because there's quite a few programs that we offer, but I guess in a nutshell, there's a couple of different types of support that is being offered through federal programs. So one really focused on supply. So whether that's new supply or existing supply. Another, I guess, toolbox of support is rental support for households. And then we also have specific support that is that really is there to build the capacity of the housing sector. And then within those buckets of new supply, existing supply, rental support for households, and support for the sector, these initiatives are either delivered directly by CMHC or by provinces and territories. And then really our toolkit in terms of the financial tools is typically financing, mortgage loan insurance, or contribution or grants. We call them contribution, but it's basically like grants or subsidies. So on the supply side, we offer a number of different programs, and they really are there to support new supply or retrofits and renovations of existing supply across what we call the housing continuum. So some programs are specifically focused on more the affordable side to ensure that that stock does get built and gets supported through renovations. And then you mentioned the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. That is more of a, at the moment, a program that is there to address the need for purpose-built rental supply. Now, that being said, government has proposed changes to the Rental Construction Financing Initiative to ensure that it is more, it moves a little bit more to the affordable side. So that's something that we're looking at. So really focused on the new construction and renovation. We also, our government also introduced a new initiative during COVID, which is called the Rental Housing, sort of Rapid Housing Initiative. And that was really in response to some of these acute housing needs that we were seeing, people who were very vulnerable, including homeless populations that, everybody was told to stay home. Well, that's really difficult if you don't have a home or not an adequate home. So the Rapid Housing Initiative enabled some of this preservation in a way, but also creation of new housing by acquiring, old motels or other type of buildings, enabling modular housing. So really something to get through, get something built quickly and house people quickly. So that was another initiative. So that's on the supply side. It is very much a toolkit approach, as I mentioned. It requires multiple approaches. So rental support is another approach that's really critical. Especially in our market now, we're seeing incomes have absolutely not kept pace with the increase in the cost of housing, with rents. And so people are struggling to make ends meet, struggling with paying a large amount of their income on housing. So there is a Canada Housing Benefit in place. It's a $4 billion program. It's cost matched with provinces and territories. They design and deliver it. And it is delivered to specific vulnerable population groups, but it's certainly not sufficient to meet those needs across the country. And then I mentioned support to the sector. So especially when it comes to preservation, and if we're thinking about not just preservation, but preservation of the affordability, we really are looking to the nonprofit sector, the co-op sector, and the role that they can play, perhaps in partnership with the private sector, to continue to support that affordability. So there is support for some of that capacity building as well. That's so much part of it. And then lastly, I would just say data, research, innovation initiatives are part of what the National Housing Strategy supports as well, because we need to continue to understand the complexities of housing, the complexities in the housing system, and enable others to make decisions on what solutions are going to be most effective. Who do we really want to impact, and use that research and data to influence decision makers to put more money towards this.
Excellent, thank you, Patricia. There definitely is a breadth of programs that are out there. Just recently, there was a new contribution program that came out for affordable housing. The MLI Select program that was launched in March. You talk about the rapid housing program. Yeah, it really is, as you say, a toolkit of support. I've also heard the term, an ecosystem of solutions. Like that is the approach. I was at a development event just a week ago, and there was talk about affordable housing, but of course, as well, housing affordability. So, those two are very distinctly different issues, but they're very connected, of course. So it's nice that and it's a blessing that we're starting to hear that conversation take place, amongst the private development industry as well, and they're interested in contributing to the problem, the housing problem. Okay, thank you very much. Very comprehensive answer. I appreciate that. Question number 3. University of BC urban design professor Patrick Condon discussed the American approach to affordable housing in his recent book, Sick City. He said the United States does somewhat a better job of providing affordable housing. Most of the USA affordable housing these days is provided through tax subsidies to corporations that are willing to do affordable housing. Sarah Stevenson, executive director of Innovative Housing in Portland, said that the nonprofit has acquired the occasional small hotel or apartment building over the years, often downtown residential hotels. And in 2011, IHI opened the Clifford Apartments, a 1911 building. The building and the organization had bought and improved, preserving 83 existing units and adding 5 more. And in 2019, IHI opened the Mann House in Laurelhurst neighborhood with 80 apartments. These projects were funded with a combination of low income and historic housing tax credits. So Iman, can you share a bit about one of your preservation projects you're working on and what impact that will have on the community, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the last 6 months, we've acquired about 165 units of unsubsidized housing and have preserved them as workforce or affordable housing at various levels of affordability. And for the most part, it has been without the use of tax credits and instead using what's called a welfare tax exemption process. And one example I'll share with you is a recent acquisition we did in the city of Pleasant Hill, which is a 71 unit community. When we saw the property, it was advertised as a value add investment where somebody could come in and purchase and increase rents. And that's usually also a key word for us, is this is an opportunity to preserve the rents. And so we took a closer look. The in-place rents were approximately 74% of area median income. Here, anything under 80% area median income, that's both occupied by a household that makes less than that, and where the rent is restricted at that level, potentially qualifies for a tax exemption. And so, that's very powerful. Instead of increasing rents by $500 or $600 a month, we can purchase a property, keep the rents where they're at, and preserve them long term at that level by applying for and receiving this tax exemption. It's a 1% tax, Prop 13 in California, restricted property tax to 1%. There are special assessments above that, but for a $20 million project, 1% savings is $200,000 a year. And so if you divide that by 71 units, you can see how that increases NOI, allows us to compete with a market rate purchaser who's making an assumption of increasing rents and offering a higher purchase price. Yet, there's this benefit to residents where that tax exemption allows us to preserve rents long term. And partly why we haven't used tax credits is that they're oversubscribed. There's been an effort, there's two types of tax credits. There's a 9% and a 4%. One is more competitive, the 9% is more competitive. It provides roughly 70% of your total development costs for new construction projects or rehabs. And the 4% credit provides maybe 40 or 50%, a little bit less. Both programs are oversubscribed for new construction, and as a result, the pool of funding tax credits available for acquisition rehab projects has shrunk over the years. And oftentimes it's used more for like an existing tax credit project that has maybe come upon its 15th year of operations and needs to do a rehab. And so unsubsidized housing, unfortunately, is very difficult to align and get tax credits for. And so what we are focused on is looking at this subsidized housing, working with local nonprofits and mission-aligned equity or debt to purchase it quickly, not having to sort of compete for these very competitive tax credits out the gate. Let's purchase it, take it off the speculative market, start to work with residents and sort of have a 10-year plan for how this property might transition to a tax credit syndication down the road or refinance into some other type of HUD financing that also provides, longer term capital at a good interest rate. And so through these strategies of a welfare tax exemption and or working with mission-aligned investors, there's a resurgence of employers in the Bay Area who are saying we can't keep our workforce local because the cost of rent, the cost of purchasing a house is skyrocketing. It's not keeping pace with salary increases. And so like we're in the Bay Area seeing some of the highest and fastest growing rates of homelessness in the country. And that's just compounded by, over 235,000 affordable rental homes that we already have a shortfall for, for those very low and extremely low income households. And so as a result, big companies are investing with mission-driven investors and community development financing institutions to deploy capital at like very inexpensive interest rates, oftentimes treated as sort of residual receipts. So to the extent that the project has the cash flow, and that enables mission-driven developers and sponsors to really go in and compete with these market focused buyers and preserve the unsubsidized housing stock that we have. It's great to, also extend the useful life of existing public housing and existing subsidized housing. But those often have 55-year deed restrictions on them. So, sometimes they're at risk if they're at the end of their deed restriction, but oftentimes, it's just, it's reached year 15 and it still has a 55-year deed restriction on it. I'd like to see, and I'm hopeful that we're starting to see more focus on putting the dollars and resources into really buying currently unsubsidized housing, market-driven housing that benefits existing residents. Over 75% of the nearly 600,000 low-income households in the Bay Area are paying more than 30% of their monthly income towards rent. And, they're often one paycheck away from losing their homes. And among this group, there's a lot of households who are living in unsubsidized affordable housing. And what we find is that, it's a variety of housing types. It's not just apartment buildings. Actually more than half of lower income renters living in unsubsidized affordable housing are living in properties with less than 9 units. And so there's a need for programs all across. There's a small sites preservation program in San Francisco, for example, focused on some of these smaller properties. But there's also ways of, purchasing larger properties. and preserving them as well. So it really is about expanding this toolkit and ecosystem of developers, sponsors who are focused on this work.
It sounds like, thank you very much, Iman. It sounds like the key to all of that holds it all together are these, not only all of the programs, but the partnerships between the various groups, whether it be government, private, nonprofit, and how everybody's, working together to help resolve the problem. And I mean, that is also as well a breadth of programs and incentives. I just wanted to switch it to another topic here. Is we know that in Canada, every level of government has a role to play in building more homes and making housing more affordable for Canadians. Provinces and territories oversee frameworks guiding land use, planning, and their targets for increasing the number of new homes. Municipalities implement policies in a manner best suited to their communities. Patricia, how does CMHC work with its provincial, territorial, and municipal counterparts to ensure an intersectional lens is placed on all the policy it develops?
Yeah, really important questions. And when you talk about partnerships, this is a really great example and an important one when it comes to other levels of government. So in the case of Canada, the provinces and territories, we really consider them our primary partners. They, of course, directly deliver. They have their own funding that they put towards housing. They have their own jurisdiction as well in housing. They have a very good understanding of their local priorities and needs. So that partnership is very important, I would say. And with the provinces and territories, we've had historically agreements in place with the provinces and territories. And as part of the National Housing Strategy, we did enter into a new sort of a framework, a multilateral framework for housing partnership, where we agree to kind of the vision of the National Housing Strategy. So really, National Housing Strategy is very much focused on meeting those housing needs across the continuum, but very focused on prioritizing those that are most vulnerable. And so that's certainly something that's the basis, I guess, of that working relationship we have, and that agreements to put those needs of individuals first. It's very much aligned with our human rights-based approach to housing as well. So we have that shared responsibility, and I would say complementary roles for housing as it relates to the provinces and territories. And with that sort of partnerships with the PT, we also have funding agreements with individual PTs. So with every single individual province and territory, there is a funding agreement. That's actually a 9-year funding agreement, which was quite different than what we had in the past, where they were a lot shorter in time frame. So it allows them to better plan according to the needs of their local jurisdiction, according to the needs of their population groups as well. And as I mentioned, they directly deliver a number of different housing programs to develop the social housing sector further, to continue to support that sector, to build new affordable housing. And of course, the provinces and territories, the municipalities are creatures of the provinces and territories, and the PTs really oversee those frameworks that guide land use planning, that guide the targets for increasing new homes as well. So it's a very important partnership for us to ensure that we can collectively meet the needs of Canadians when it comes to housing. That's what we're ultimately all here and focused on, and ensuring that we play those complementary roles. Then I would say with municipalities, we do a lot of work with municipalities sort of on the ground, because municipalities are eligible for these programs that we offer as well. So we do work with them on a very close basis to ensure that we can help fund and co-fund a number of projects so that they can continue to expand their housing stock as well. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there in terms of that specific question, but it really goes to the point around partnership and kind of all hands on deck. I think other levels of government, other players in the industry as well. And just to mention, I talked about the toolkit earlier, which I think is really, there's no other way but to ensure that you can offer a number of different programs and incentives, etc. But even with that, the federal toolkit that we offer, that this government offers to the National Housing Strategy, it's a significant investment, but it's not nearly enough to address all the needs that are out there. It plays a role, but it really is, we still have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. There is a lot of work to do, and I the partnerships, it just keeps coming back to that, and that's really critical. Just being cognizant of time, I know we also have questions that the registrants and attendees would like to ask. If we can switch over. So I'd like to hand this back over to you, Caroline.
No problem. Thank you, Alfredo. Now we're going to move into our audience Q&A session. So for anyone who would like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box. To start us off, we have received a few questions from the attendees upon their registration, as well as one question here. So the first question is, can you talk more about the programs in place to support or help develop community housing in Canada?
Yeah, I can talk about I guess two things. One is the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. So that's an initiative that was launched as part of the National Housing Strategy. It provides both a combination of low-cost financing as well as contribution funding. It does prioritize, as these applications come in, it prioritizes housing projects that serve the needs of specific vulnerable population groups. So there is a prioritization that happens when these applications roll in. It is the co-investment fund, so it does very much actually rely on those partnerships, and it was intentionally designed to bring other partners to the table as well. So hence the co. But we also are finding that's quite difficult, especially for nonprofits and for co-ops sometimes, to bring those other partners and other funding sources in. So we constantly are looking at that program to help improve it. It is more geared towards the affordable housing side and to work with nonprofits and co-ops. We also, the government made a new commitment as part of the last federal budget to develop a new cooperative housing program. And so that's an opportunity for us that we are very much embracing, to work with the cooperative housing sector to actually make sure that that program that's partly funded actually by funds from the co-investment fund, that it becomes as accessible as possible. Because one thing that we also often hear on our end is that these application processes can be very taxing, and some of the smaller groups just simply don't have the capacity to provide all of this information, to get all of these reports, and they just simply don't have the people, the capacity, the experience to do that. So it's something that's very much top of mind for us to continue to improve that process, to listen to what our clients are saying, to now with this new co-op program, take that opportunity as well to make sure that it's as accessible as possible. Because it's a lending and a contribution program combined, as soon as you start talking about lending, it does become a bit more complex and there is underwriting involved. But we're very mindful that we want to make sure that these programs are as accessible as possible. But I would say the new co-op program, as well as the existing National Housing Co-Investment Fund, are really meant to continue to grow that community housing sector, combined with the existing initiatives to protect that social housing projects with continued subsidies.
Thank you. That's very helpful and lots of insight there. The second question, what role or obligations do you see for the private sector to provide affordable housing, especially as profit margins in the market sector are typically higher? Maybe,
I'm happy to talk
Iman.
a little bit about that. So, that's inherently the challenge, right? You have market rate developers who have a certain mindset, and it is very easy to buy an apartment building and make a lot of profit by increasing rents. I think that there is a growing sort of social awareness and desire to and a willingness to take a lower return. So instead of 20% return, we're happy with a 5 or 6 or 7 or 8% return, knowing that we're also creating a secondary benefit or a double bottom line or triple bottom line, as some people talk about it, of strengthening communities, ensuring that residents can remain in their neighborhoods and connected to their social networks and schools and jobs. And so more capital is becoming available to sponsors who have that mindset. And so in some regards, it's attractive to larger investors who have the funds already, because it provides sort of a more stable and less risk adjusted way of sort of investing in real estate, yet also doing good. And so I think we're seeing an influx of previously just market rate focused developers who are creating affordable housing investment arms. We're also seeing large hospitals, tech companies in Silicon Valley, all sort of creating $500 million, $1 billion funds focused on preserving affordable and workforce housing. And so it really, and so given that, why is it that AC rehab is still not commonplace? And I think it really does get back to, it does require a distinct set of skills and capacities within the institutions, the support, the developers, and that sort of ecosystem hasn't fully formed. And it really will take sort of partnerships at the regional, local, state, federal level to bring these AC rehabs to the greater scale. And yet it's an exciting time in that we're seeing a renewed interest in this approach. And I think that with these types of panels and sharing of best practices, we're going to continue to see that. For the again, and it's a large variety. There's ways to make profit preserving affordable housing, and so I see, and there's a large spectrum. Like when we talk about preserving housing at the ELI, VLI levels, like 30%, 40%, 50% AMI, that's a different strategy than, let's say, workforce housing preservation. There's a very much market-led industry in the Bay Area that's sort of popped up in the last 3 or 4 years, called the Joint Powers Authority, for example, preservation. And that involves partnering with a local jurisdiction to issue government bonds that have historically been used for like building libraries and schools to build to either purchase or build workforce housing. So we're seeing a lot of market rate buyers issue $200 million in bonds through government agencies to purchase 150, 200, 300 unit apartment buildings that are more or less, built after the 80s, 90s, some brand new, to create workforce housing sort of in the 80 to 120% AMI range. And when you look at some of the economics of those deals, they actually outperform market rate returns on investment. And so a lot of it is creative financing. Ultimately, I think, a good program balances that with outcomes for residents, and really creating that public benefit. And so, it's exciting to see this new sort of ecosystem. And I've always felt that, affordable housing can't get built or preserved just with a small pool of developers, mission, oriented developers. It really will take participation from, larger institutions, market rate institutions, to get interested in this, so that we start to really move the needle and build enough or preserve enough. And so it is encouraging to see a growth and interest in this space.
If you don't mind me jumping on that as well, as I'm thinking about this question, because we often talk about this a lot within my team and other teams as well, and what does it actually mean when you're talking affordability, and what do we expect from other partners? So when we talk about the private sector, I mean, you can only expect so much in terms of the depth of affordability. And so, yeah, what if it's affordability for workforce housing? It might be quite different than affordability for those making less than $15,000 a year, let's say. And so also, you know, as we're having these conversations, thinking about what it will take to create that level of affordability, because we talk about affordability in the market, but when it's about affordable housing, yeah, you will require sometimes some different business models or partnerships, or maybe this is more of that role where governments, such as the federal government, plays to ensure that really that affordability, that deep affordability gets supported. And as we talk about partnerships, it's partnerships to build and run the housing, but it's also to link it to other services. So when we're talking about deep affordability, or when you talk about people dealing with mental health and drug addiction, or housing those that are chronically homeless, to be able to be successful, we need to combine the housing with other supports and services, wraparound supports and services. Sometimes those services are offered by other levels of government, and how do you ensure that level of coordination as well? So you don't just house somebody and walk away from it, but ensuring that you really set them up for success and provide them with any other wraparound supports or services, health services, whatever that means, looks like. So just wanted to add that other angle to it as well, in terms of depth of affordability, and the need to really integrate other supports and services.
Thank you, Patricia. Alfredo, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, not too much. I mean, it's a lot's been said, but it is great to hear on both sides of the border that, you know, you're hearing, it was, I think maybe a year or two ago, Scotiabank announcing 10 billion, you know, then you hear on the other side of the border, you hear, you know, Google and Apple announcing, you know, $1 billion, you know, investments. I mean, it just feels like that's a positive thing. And to, you know, does it have to fall on nonprofits alone? Does it have to fall on cooperatives and government alone? You know, can we not inspire everybody to get involved, and including the private industry that is, you know, that does have the experience and the knowledge and resources to really push out the product that needs to be that's needed. And so, you know, it's just a conversation that we're having today to encourage more conversation, and that's really it.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. So what is the primary reason for the loss of approximately 4 affordable housing units for every one created? Who would like to take this first? Patricia?
Well, I'm sure we all have something to say about that, but I guess it depends on what you're measuring. Are you measuring, I guess, how you're physically losing units? So obviously there's always conversions happening, or like to non-residential, or there might be demolitions happening. I remember when I was in the States, what we were seeing a lot in Florida is those trailer parks that were right along the coast. So perfect location, but also really very affordable housing for those residents. But those were getting bought up and changed into condos. And when we saw lots of rental properties changed into condos, and then actually after the crash, they changed back to rentals, but at higher rents. So there's, I guess, various ways that we're losing affordability. We're losing, actually, I guess, you know, physical stock, but also the level of affordability. That's what I would be more focused on, is we're losing, I guess, level of affordability in some of these cases where something may have been affordable, but for various reasons now it's really out of reach for those that were relying on that type of housing, and they have nowhere else to go in their community. So I would say it's, yeah, probably depends a bit on how you measure it, but those are some of my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. You know, there was an estimate that as of 2017 in the Bay Area, the 9-county Bay Area, there was roughly 282,000 unsubsidized affordable housing units throughout the 9 Bay Area counties. And, you know, as rents have skyrocketed, lower income households are leaving the region. The number of these unsubsidized lower income households or units has decreased by approximately 32,000 a year in the Bay Area. And so, and again, these are a range of housing types. We have people living in 4plexes, 5plexes, you know, a lot of smaller multifamily buildings, all the way up to larger apartment buildings, 50 or more units. And so, this high cost and the demand for, property owners to want to constantly reposition their properties is sort of a constant threat to these unsubsidized units, and as a result, why we're losing them at the pace we are. And so that, coupled with the lack of, this ecosystem or government programs and the bench of developers focused on preserving unsubsidized housing, it is sort of why we're losing it. And again, there are tons of benefits to doing preservation. From, it's an anti-displacement program. It allows you to make sure that, existing residents can continue to stay in their neighborhoods. It's one thing to build a new affordable housing community over here and say, great, go move there. It's much nicer, I think, for residents who are already part of a community. Maybe they've lived in a part of San Francisco for 20 years and they want to, stay in that community, being able to preserve their housing and their unit and their neighborhoods. It's much faster and cost effective. We're seeing that new construction can take 5-6 years through all the regulatory red tape and entitlements and not in my backyard sentiment or movement. And rehab and preservation could happen in a matter of months. And there's an analysis that showed that on average, it costs 50 to 70% less the cost of new construction to preserve existing housing. So, despite all of these things, it creates flexible choices of different types of housing, studios, 1-bedrooms, 9-unit buildings, 50-unit buildings. It's also environmentally a good strategy. Like the best way to help the environment is to just use a building that's already there, right? Then, the carbon footprint is a lot lower than building something new. And so from a lot of perspectives, it's great. I think really comes down to, it's not as widely spread or commonplace because we need to develop this ecosystem and toolkits and make sure that mission-oriented sponsors and developers have the resources they need and the support and partnerships they need to effectively, create a movement around this particular area.
Thank you so much. And before we wrap up today, I'd like to pass the floor over to our panelists one last time to speak about where we go from here. So Patricia, let's start with you.
Where do we go from here? I think these conversations are really critical. Also to make some new connections, of course. And just to, I guess recap, it's to me that the partnerships are really critical. And it sounds a little bit cliche, maybe sometimes, like partnerships and innovation, but I think sometimes it doesn't have to be that complex either. We know what some of the problems are in front of us, and it is a complex system, I guess. But the partnerships and bringing these brains together and looking to see what is possible, I think it's just really critical to continue to think about our existing stock, as you both talked about as well. We have existing communities that where people are thriving, and so how do we ensure that we really preserve and protect that existing stock as much as we can, while at the same time also intensifying, densifying these various sites and adding the stock that we also know that we need to house everyone in Canada and new people that are continuing to come in as well. So I think the partnership is really really critical, and having these open conversations, I would say.
Thank you. And Iman, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think, I appreciate you putting this panel together and opening up this discussion about preserving affordable housing and anti-displacement, really, which goes hand in hand. I think we need to look at how we can take this acquisition, rehab, and preservation work to scale. I mean, I think that's the challenge that we're facing. Is there are pockets of practitioners and programs that are focused on this, but how do we take this to scale? And there's a number of things we could do. Like, the first is sort of securing funding and financing, perhaps beyond just what local communities have. There's a number of examples of cities throughout the Bay Area, growing interest in New York, cities like New York, Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, where there's growing efforts for preserving and creating programs around this. But how do we, perhaps introduce regional level solutions, or state and federal level solutions? One example in the Bay Area is the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, which was recently created to take a more regional approach to some of these issues. Secondly, I think we talked a lot about strengthening and building partnerships. The tenant advocacy groups, the nonprofits, the community-based organizations, community development financing institutions, making sure people are talking and focused on the right things. And then supporting capacity building for sponsors who are interested in this work, and there's a unique set of skill sets required to be successful. And how do you get a welfare tax exemption? What are the rules around this? And so making sure that we're strengthening those lessons learned and learning from each other of what are the best practices, where does preservation work in other communities, what are the different types of tax incentives and programs that we can do to preserve housing, looking at tax credits as one of the solutions, and then continuing to sort of strengthen our partners. So those are my recommendations.
Thank you, Iman and Patricia. Alfredo, I'll pass the floor back to you.
Yeah, for myself, it's not only awareness, it's not only education, but for us at 3H Properties, it's really trying to inspire the development community to get more involved in affordable housing. So if we can do that with this conversation, that would be amazing. But I also just want to point out the fact, just reflecting on the conversation today, it's really the partnerships. We today have a U.S. developer, a Canadian affordable housing developer, and CMHC working together to talk about this topic. And I think it's just very indicative of this movement that's taking place to really bring light to the need to address affordable housing and housing affordability. So I think that's pretty cool. Just want to also say thank you very much, everybody, for listening. I want to show our gratitude to our panelists today, and say that 3H Properties has made a contribution to the Foundations for Social Change, which is a Vancouver-based charitable organization that develops innovative programs helping vulnerable populations in our communities. We picked this organization because it speaks to the values that align with our shared ethos, bound by our shared humanity, and it is our responsibility to build an inclusive society where everyone has opportunity to achieve their full potential. And as generations to come, are blessed with a bright future. So thank you again, everybody, for taking the time to speak with us today. And I'll pass it back to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Alfredo. Looking forward, 3H Properties will also be hosting another panel discussion this summer looking at topic of optimization versus maximization in affordable housing development with Bob Dritzies, Vice President, Financing Affordable Housing Specialist at Peak Hill Capital, Jeff Thomas, Group Head Development at KingSet Capital, and Jordan Hugendam, owner of Zon Engineering. The webinar will discuss improving quality of life, health, and wellness for tenants through environmental and energy solutions and new innovative construction techniques while providing a reasonable and fair return to investors. Panelists will follow up with any unanswered questions after this webinar. Thank you again for joining us today. And if there are further questions, feel free to reach out to us. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.